Okay, good morning. So, today in the next 8 minutes, we're going to zoom out. We're going to zoom out to look at how any digital economy at scale can be visualized, can be designed, can be implemented, and what are most importantly, what is the mental model we must carry when designing such systems. Okay, to understand, to really solve for such large-scale problems like security and resilience, we need to first understand what are the three pillars of any digital economy, not just India, but anywhere in the world. The first is digital identity, which is who I am, right? It's very important for, issuing credentials, buying, assets, or sort of, connecting with, gaining access to various benefits, etc., right? So, first is digital identity, which defines who I am. The second is digital assets, what I own, right? What I have, exactly, right? It could be money, it could be assets, it could be anything, it could be knowledge. Anything can be an asset. My time could also be an asset. And the third pillar is what I do with what I have, right? How do I transact with the assets that I have, right? The transaction could be with money, with products, with services, with time, right? So, if you want to build a secure and resilient economy, we need to tackle all these three pillars. We need to make all these three pillars secure and resilient, right? And then, once we have identified them, we also need to place them in sort of a large-scale architecture, which allows for not just innovation, but also expansion and growth at scale. Right? So this is how we visualize a large-scale economy with and how we place all of these things. The bottommost layers is the digital public goods, the DPG layer, right? Which is generally sort of built and maintained by the open source communities of the world, right? Why open source? Because if you really look at it, most of the most secure softwares and applications today have been built by open source. It has never been maintained by like just one company or something. Why? Because when you open source any piece of software or asset or anything, there are thousands of developers trying to look at it, trying to break it, and trying to sort of make it more secure and resilient. So open source software, open source standards, open source protocols become the foundation, right, of any secure and resilient economy. Right. Second is that the second layer over here is the digital public infrastructure layer. How do you use the digital public goods and create a large-scale infrastructure that allows for innovation, right, in all of these three layers, right? This is generally done by the technology companies, not-for-profit companies, organizations. Mostly this is sort of like a tech infrastructure, but orchestrated by institutions, right, like governments or consortiums, etc. And naturally, with the existence of the DPG layer and the DPI layer, it creates a natural innovation in the public and private sector, right? It sort of comes out as an emergent behavior, right? Nobody needs to force it automatically, these things start coming out, right? So we are going to look at each of these three layers and look at some examples that are happening across the globe and across, especially in India and etc., and how each of them is tackling one small part of the problem to create a larger digital economy. Let's look at the first layer, digital public goods, right? Digital public goods, I'm going to talk about open standards and protocol. I just talked about open source software. Open standards and protocols sort of create the bedrock of sort of, of exponential innovation, right? I mean, we all know the internet, right? The internet is nothing but a bunch of standards, a bunch of documents, right? Which a bunch of tech companies came and implemented together. And if you look at it, just because we standardized how communication takes place between computers, we had technologies emerge like HTTP, FTP, TCP, which allowed for large innovations. Today we have giants like Google and Meta and Uber. All of this innovation would not have happened if the basic communication infrastructure of the internet was not standardized, right? Another analogy to be looked at is how standardization really helped explode the entire logistics sector, right? We had Sindhuja yesterday talk about logistics. Just by standardizing the container, and if you look further, even standardizing of the railway gauge allowed for standardization of the entire logistics industry. Just imagine if if the railway gauge or the container was not standardized, right, you would need separate sized vehicles, separate sized trains, separate manufacturing units, everything would have to happen in silos, right? But just because we standardized the containers, it allowed for innovation in the layers that happened above, right? Then let's look at the second layer, the digital public infrastructure layer. Now, we have heard this term for a while now, so I'm going to focus on two important digital public infrastructures. We will touch about the other obvious ones later. One is obviously backend enabled open networks, right? I am the co-author of backend protocol. Backend enabled open networks today are now becoming implemented in various sectors, in ONDC, Honest, Namayatri, some of these things you must have already heard of. One recent network that has recently been launched is the Unified Energy Interface. You would have heard Akhil talk about it. And this allows for building resilient, decentralized, distributed networks with no single point of failure, where anybody on any application can transact with any other guy on any other application, right? So currently open networks enabled by backend protocol are seeing millions of transactions, especially in India and across the globe. There are several initiatives in Brazil and in Africa and in Europe as well, right? Now, we talked about assets earlier, right? Now, if you really think about it, everybody's asset is somebody's resource, right? Yeah. Now, we transact on resource. If I own an asset, it has some inherent value, but that value cannot be realized until I transact it, right? So, the open network digital infrastructure is used to transact on resources. Now, that brings us to a relatively new DPI which is currently in the works, which is called the Internet. Right? For those who have not heard of Internet, do check out Nandan's talk on Internet on the GFF on YouTube. It's a fascinating talk on how we can tokenize assets. Let's just take the example of the Unified Energy Interface. Right? If I have a battery today, right? If I had to monetize it, I'll have to either monetize the whole battery or not. But what if I could say 25% of my battery I'm going to use it for P2P trading, 25% I'm going to use it for, let's say, storage, and the remaining 50% I'm going to use it for now, right? So, infrastructures like the Internet allow you to tokenize your asset. It could be tokenizing your battery, tokenizing your money, tokenizing your time, and actually allow each of those assets to be listed somewhere on a ledger so that it can be transacted for different purposes, different credentials can be attached to it, and different sort of operations can be done on it, right? So, that is the asset part of it. Right? So, we have talked about, and obviously we have other DPIs like, identity for our, like Aadhaar for identity and UPI for payments, etc. So, all of these are DPIs that are forming the second layer, right? And automatically, once these layers are set up, you suddenly open up this entire ecosystem for innovation across every layer, across every building block. And these are some of the examples of the innovations that have happened, right? Just by leveraging all of these DPGs and the DPIs, right? And to summarize, how to build a resilient and secure economy, first and foremost, right, as some of our friends also talked about today, is to first change our mental model, right? It is not about one person solving everything. It is an entire ecosystem that has to come together and collaborate together to solve problems at scale. Imagine any ecosystem as layers and building blocks, right? Understand what the layers are, and then define which layer are you operating in, and solve for a very simple problem in that layer. And abstract. When you are designing a resilient infrastructure, always look at domain agnosticity and not domain specificity, which means that if you're solving a problem in one domain, it should be portable to another domain, right? And this is more for developers. Whenever you're building something, don't scale whatever that works, because that's a typical sort of mental model of every sort of startup today. Okay, we'll build something, we'll build a small MVP, and then we'll figure out how to scale it at the end, right? But if you want to hit scale, you can't scale whatever is working. You have to build what works at scale, right? Scale has to be baked into the design itself, right? So these are the 4 design principles on how to build a digital resilient and secure digital economy. We at FIDE and Beckon are actually collaborating and building these DPGs and collaborating with various existing DPIs like ONDC, UEI, etc. to build such products, leverage such DPIs, and build open source products for the community. So if anybody wants to collaborate, please do reach out, and we'll be happy to partner with you.